I'd like to tell you a bit about my father. Donald Arthur James would be 100 years old this month, if he were alive. But he didn't get close. He died in 1998 before he made 80, his mind destroyed by dementia, a sweet and docile man who'd spent the last few months of his life in a care home. But his significant birthday has prompted me to dig out the photographs I have of him from the suitcase in the basement. They've always been there, available right from my childhood. It was possible to dip into the bags and boxes and albums, but I never showed much curiosity before. Why would I care about those soppy things from the olden days, fuzzy black and white images of people I barely knew? But now, more than 20 years after his death, I've been studying each one zealously, searching faces familiar and unknown for clues to tell me more about who he was. Why only now, I wonder, when it's too late to ask for details? There are two bookend images of my dad, one a few weeks after his birth, the other a few weeks before his death. In the early one, he's laid out on a piece of furniture, his head resting on dark pillows like a prize vegetable or a pet to be captured by the photographer, whom I imagine under a black hood, waving a toy to get his attention. Watch the birdie. There are a couple of other pictures of Dad as a toddler, a sweet little boy, well-behaved and uncomplaining by the look of it, characteristics that would never change. But the earliest photograph of him with features that I recognise is captioned, "Don, aged 16 years." And there he sits, obediently in white shirt, neat tie, a wide lapelled jacket, shoulders posed in a three-quarter turn, his face looking directly at me from the 1930s. A schoolboy, a smart, good-looking lad, but anxious too, and short-sighted. Those specks are there in every picture throughout his life. He has the same high forehead he would always have. His plentiful hair is swept back and glistens with oil under the studio lights. The width of his mouth surprises me. Then, here he is at 19, this time looking a bit stiff and awkward, but obediently holding the pose as instructed by the photographer, gazing off into the middle distance, the pipe a prop intended to illustrate gritty confidence. Still a teenager and smoking a pipe. But handsome, bloody handsome. I can see exactly what Mum would see in him when they met. 4 years later, the two of them were clearly dating. Courting, they'd have said. Joan Kathleen Izzard was 2 years younger and taught dance classes in Northampton, where they both lived, at the Vera Pettit School for Dance. Family legend has it that Dad came for ballroom lessons. She set her eyes on the taller, good-looking, shy chap, 2 years her senior, just right, with the round tortoiseshell spectacles, and, well, that was that. Mum usually got what she'd set her heart on. Certainly the photos show times of laughter and fun, boating and picnics, flirting and larking about in the summer sunshine as the world tips inexorably to war. In one wonderful shot, Mum is perched high on his shoulders in the way each of us 3 kids would be later. Before I could form the word carry, I'd beg for a shoulder ride with the cry, "Cally up," with my arms reaching high in the air. He never refused, even as I got older and heavier. In their version, Mum, aged 18, is in a dress that shows a lot of leg for 1940. It seems a bit saucy, as if I really shouldn't look. I think Dad was called up for army service in the early 40s. I can't imagine he volunteered. He wasn't the gung-ho type. He wanted to join the RAF, but couldn't because of his poor eyesight. Mum was soon in uniform too, in the Land Army. While he was doing his basic training, Mum sent a lot of photos of herself, up a ladder, on a haystack, hugging a cow called Ginger, feeding the pigs, cutting turnips. On the back, she's written, "On the farm, just across the fields. Don't you think the donkey is lovely? I'm a bit brown, aren't I?" She signs one with, "All my love, Snugs," a name I never heard either of them use. On one photograph, taken out in the fields and marked January, Mum has written, "Tough guy? Do you think I've altered?" And in April 1943, perhaps 3 months after the other, she repeats, "Do you think I've altered at all, darling?" She's hinting at something, hoping for Dad to compliment her on new curves, perhaps, but clearly not getting the hoped-for response. That's Dad. It took a while to get him enthused about anything. She scribbles on one, "I'm writing to you. Have you received that letter yet? as if he wasn't as forthcoming as she was. And that fits too. Mum was always the more outgoing, confident and sociable of the two, at least when I knew them. Front foot and back foot, Tigger and Eeyore, as I said at his funeral. Not a bad combination. No, Dad never sought the limelight, quite the opposite. I remember as a child learning to read and struggling with one word I hadn't come across before. I asked Dad what it meant. Embarrassed? Well, he said, if you were at a cafe and you realised the people at the next table were talking about you, that's what you'll be. Embarrassed. Wow, I thought. I like that. People talking about me. I'm really embarrassed. For his 70th birthday, he made me promise just to send a card or to ring, not organise any surprises or even visit. We were very different. Three photographs in particular have caught my eye in a different way. In one, Dad is stretched out near a tree on the bank of a wide river. Boats and bicycles feature heavily in the courting years. His hair is shorter at the sides but floppy on top, and it tumbles down in a dishevelled way as if he's been doing something active, rowing, swimming, something else. He's grinning at the camera, leaning on his elbow. One leg is tucked under him and the other, looking impossibly long, is stretched out towards the rushes. He's slim and fit. The middle part of his body is in deep shadow. On the back he's written July 1941, naked and unashamed. It's true. He's not wearing a stitch. The shadows hide his nudity. As a recent convert to naturism, I'm a tiny bit shocked, but mostly delighted. Dad, I'm proud of you. But where was this devil-may-care persona during my lifetime? The other two are of Mum, both from spring 1943, but 1 month apart, April and May. In the first, she sits wrapped up in her Land Army uniform of thick coat, long woolen socks and sensible shoes. There are 2 bicycles, no crossbars, leaning against the bench, and some litter under it. Not hers, she couldn't abide that. Her body language and expression are shy and girlish. She's written, Swanspool, Wellingborough. Maybe you remember this seat. Only 20 years here. Why should he remember that bench, I wonder? What earthly pleasures did they share there? I have a queasy sensation, but so what if they were young lovers seizing whatever chance they could to share their affection, perhaps while Dad was home on leave. I have a freedom of sexual expression unimaginable then. And a few weeks later, there's Mum in the fields, wearing jodhpurs tucked into socks with those chunky shoes and a light blouse and sweater. Her pose says it all. She's turned away from the camera, looking back at us, her hands resting on a sturdy fence and one foot raised on the lowest bar. The tight jodhpurs emphasize the shape of her bottom. Her head is at an angle that's all confidence and challenge, her hair swept back off her face. She looks, what's the word? Sexy. If I told you this was a Hollywood starlet, I think you'd believe me. But the real clincher is what she's written in her neat, flowing style. May 1943. Notice I'm now a woman. 21 years old. It reeks of seduction. This is what she's been hinting at. If they hadn't already made love, she was presumably pointing out what was now possible on his next weekend home. In the next batch of photographs, Dad is in his army uniform. Loose shirt with epaulettes, khaki serge jacket and trousers with ironed crease, and that pipe clutched in his right hand with a ring on his little finger. Still so handsome, and now more self-assured, connecting with us. He looks ready for anything. Was he ready for India? That's where he was sent for his war effort. How long was he there? How dangerous was it? What stories did he have of the journey, the people, the events? I'm amazed how little I know. He was in the signals. What that meant in day-to-day terms, I haven't a clue, but when we watched black and white war films on the telly as kids, Dad would always know what any Morse code message was. Did-it-did-ah-did, he would mutter as the buzzer tapped away, and then mutter quietly, U-boats approaching, south-southeast 2 miles. Followed by Kenneth More or Jack Hawkins telling us exactly the same thing. It was a kind of magic skill, but of no use to me, and that's all he ever revealed about those years. Why wasn't he more forthcoming? No. Why wasn't I more curious? While rummaging through the old photographs, I found this small album I hadn't seen before. 58 tiny black and white photographs, each about 2 inches by 1 inch, mostly views of India, with a few identifying words. Into Assam, the journey up from Calcutta to Manipur Road, the famous Firpos, Dobi, Chowringhee, Howrah Bridge, the Brahmaputra. And in the front of the album he's glued a poem, cut from a newspaper by the look of it. I can't find out who wrote it or when, but it seems so relevant for this young man ripped from his home and his sweetheart and sent halfway across the world to do whatever was required in service of king and country. And when I go home, and the first fond frenzy of welcome has quieted, they'll say, "Well, and how did you like India?" And I, too happy to think, will reply, "Oh, it was all right." India, the golden peacock of the world, was all right. But later the wells of memory will flood, and I shall see again a dawn breaking over the Murray Hills, filtering sunlight onto a misty plain where cattle move like legless ghosts, noontide in the bazaar, and a queer nostalgia for the sounds and smells, oxen carts and donkeys, and a motley of vendors. And to round the day, a sunset over the plains, an aching desert of sand and scrub, and far away a distant tree, solitary against the sky. The mail surges on, gulping distance in days where once the Moguls trod in years. Yet each morning brings the same sight, the plain and the distant tree, sunshine heat, flies, desert, mountains, and lush green valleys, and through it all a thing wailing. Memory holds the door, and I can leap an age and live again with the conquerors. In other words, he would always have those shocking, vibrant images in his mind, whatever might happen to him, wherever he might be, and he would hold them close, keeping them private all his life. And the men, his fellow soldiers, what memories of them, what adventures did they have, these mates he lived with in such close proximity, so far from home, in such alien circumstances, while writing home to his sweetheart Joan? What bonds did they form? What secrets did they share? In a photograph taken on Christmas Day 1944, there's a lineup of a dozen men, half of them in rudimentary drag, with skirts, headscarves, padded shirts and rouged cheeks. Dad's not one of them, so he must have taken the picture. I will never know if he dragged up too. I really hope he did. On one page the photos are fixed with silver corners. A coincidence? There are portraits of Fred Berlin sitting on a wall, one leg up, the other dangling. There's Jack Brereton on the same wall, same uniform, but sitting awkwardly for the shot. And then there's Steve. Just Steve. Did Dad not know him well enough to add his surname, or know him so well that it wasn't necessary? Steve's face has been cut out from a bigger picture. Why? He's in a different location, outside a rough building in the sunshine, wearing a white t-shirt and grinning at the camera. His eyes are narrowed either because of the sun or from laughing at a joke just told. It could have been taken last week. Who was Steve? What was the joke he had shared with my dad? Steve would be about 100 this year too, if he even survived the war. There's one picture of 8 of them, including Dad, relaxed and informal, one shirtless. On the back he's written their names: Bert, Jim, Archie, Jack, Alec, Marco, Paul, Joe. It's Archie next to Dad who has his shirt off. But Dad has referred to himself as Jim, not the Don or Donald everyone else called him. It was Mum's father who, because his surname was James, called him Jimmy. That must have stuck through the war years, but it's odd to think he had this other existence. Once upon a time he was young, he was single, he was Jim. He was 34 when I was born, so he was only my dad for 44 of his 78 years. One of those men I knew a little, the other not at all. Did he see action, fire a gun, see friends die? Did he kill? Oh, Daddy, tell me your stories. The whole of the final page of the album is taken up with a picture of a church, a very English church, as if to remind him of home. Perhaps it was a church in Northampton where he and Joan had promised to be wed one day, darling, when all this nonsense is over. He came home, I'm pretty sure, in the summer of '45, and just a few months later, on December the 1st, Don and Joan did get married. He in his army uniform, she in a beautiful soft white gown with silk details at the hems. I know it was soft because years later I would find that dress in a box under their bed, remove the layers of tissue paper, slip it on and swirl around the house when she was out. I wonder if she knew. Outside the church, Mum holds a dramatic bouquet of orchids and ferns and has a single string of pearls around her neck. He's 25, she's 23. He's seen so much. She's seen Northampton. They'd been writing to each other for ages, promising they'd soon be together, and now they were. They look happy, content and confident. They'd made their choice, and they made it work for over half a century. Their honeymoon was in Torquay. There are no photographs of them during that time. Why? It's easy to guess. They had other priorities. 8.5 months after the wedding, my brother was born. A few years later came my sister, and 9 years after that, me, the mistake. With hindsight, I fancy that my mum poured love into me, determined that I shouldn't feel unwanted and that she'd show Dad, we can do this. I also imagine that although he did care for this new baby, somehow his heart wasn't in it. Duty, not pleasure. I say we were never close, but there was no friction, just a coolness. My brother's arrival and early days are documented with photographs at an almost weekly rate. My sister's about the same. The first picture of me is when I'm already 5 months old. Only one letter survives from all their years together. It's written by Dad from Beastly Brum on May the 5th, 1958, Mum's 36th birthday. He was working in Birmingham during the week, living in digs and returning to the family home in Northampton only at weekends. As well as chat about the weather, the garden and how stupid he'd been staying up reading until nearly 12, he comments on how much he'd enjoyed spending the weekend together, painting the kitchen chairs. I realise that I need you more and more as time goes on, so don't ever leave me, will you? She didn't, even after his affair. There are plenty of photos of us as a family. We look a happy bunch, and I think we were, more or less. Very few show just Dad and me, mainly because he was the one who took the photos, so it's nearly always Mum and one or more of the kids. But there are a few of the two of us, one on the shingle beach in Norfolk, where I still go. He's fishing, I'm looking out to sea. Then he gives me the rod to reel in one of the countless sand dabs he'd catch for our dinner. He was probably trying to encourage me to take up one of his favourite pastimes. That was never going to work, just as the boxing gloves he bought me one Christmas were always going to gather dust. When I was around 6 or 7, he told me that boys don't cry. My response, as I hung my coat up in the cupboard under the stairs, was matter of fact. But I do, Daddy, don't I? We lark about in the garden, we look at the boats in a harbour, and notice how I've chosen a shirt similar to my Dad's. I must have looked up to him. I remember the first time I caught the whiff of my Dad on another man, a teacher, I think. I was very confused. It was the smell of Old Spice. We never rowed or fought. The channels of communication weren't deep enough for such authenticity. We were quietly respectful of each other, but wary, withdrawn to a distance where details weren't visible. When I came out to my parents by letter from university, I received 2 letters back, one from him, one from her. I can only imagine the conversations between them on receiving my news. Blame and horror, perhaps. Surprise? Probably not. Disappointment, I'm sure. They each said, in so many words, "We thought that might be the case, but we wish you hadn't told us." That closed any meaningful communication between us for many, many years. The most central part of me, and they would rather not know. Why tell them anything again? It was only after my Dad died, and I knew that cancer would soon take my mum too, that I asked her about that time. When I wrote to tell you both that I was gay, was Dad upset? Mum, on a stool in front of the open fire, poked the logs for a while. No, he said, as long as he loves someone. I told a therapist that, with a sense of relief, a few weeks later when I was grieving over her death. He responded, "What a shame he couldn't have said that to you at the time." Yes, of course, but he could never have spoken those words aloud. I wish it was otherwise, and I have regrets, but not anger. When I look at the pictures of him at 16, at 25, a soldier, a husband, a father, whoever he was before I knew him, however he was changed by the events he witnessed, whatever damage he suffered and never discussed, he did his best. In the 70s, the photographs burst into colour, and there we are in clothes of yellow and red. The sky is blue, the grass is green. Our family gets smaller again as my brother leaves home, then my sister too. But there are still laughs. Dad ages, but in a classy man at CNA kind of way. Still handsome, a little bit Clint Eastwood, I like to think. Then holidays are without any of the kids, just the two of them, grandparents now. Mum takes a few more pictures, some successfully, others less so. Their marriage survives to mark 50 years together. Still laughing, caring for each other, but Mum doing more of the caring as Dad's mental faculties fail and he retreats into an even more private world. The final picture I have of Dad, this small one in a cheap frame that came from a cracker at our last Christmas together, was taken when he went into the care home. It's the photograph staff used to identify the residents when they could no longer identify themselves. His mind had gone, more or less, and there was nothing that didn't confuse him. Facts, memories, people, words. He imagined he was angling again from a boat on a lake and would see fish in the patterns of the carpet. But he's recognisably my dad in this photo too. High forehead, hair grey now, swept back, strong jawline, soft eyes behind the glasses, and kind lips that would pucker up at anyone's approach, knowing that carers, family, or a fellow resident might offer a kiss and he'd reciprocate without hesitation. His character hasn't changed. He was still kind and sweet, affectionate and diffident, always a gentleman. I wish I'd known him better. I wish I'd been as curious then as I am now, and I wish he'd shared more of himself with me. But I have to accept we both had our reasons not to. Once, in the 1980s, after watching me as the lead in a play at Birmingham Rep, a massive role, never off stage, he sidled up to me and whispered, "I thought I'd find it embarrassing watching you, but I didn't. I really didn't." I relished that moment. My dad, not embarrassed. He ended his letter to Mum in 1958 with a PS. "My love to all the perishers. I do hope Jonty is back to normal." I was 4 at the time. I guess I'd been ill. But normal? My normal was always far from his normal. But it's worked for me. The care he showed in subtle, unobtrusive ways allowed me to explore my own normality. He never tried to check or restrict me, unable as he must have been to comprehend my style. He allowed me to grow away from his template and create my own world. If knowing he was being talked about embarrassed him, imagine how mortified he'd be to hear these words. "Well, I'm sorry, Dad, but I need to say this. Only now, in the safety provided by your absence, do I dare to announce this simple truth. I love you. I realize I always did, and that you loved me. Happy 100th birthday, Papa."